Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. China's premier warned on Tuesday that the country faces a tough struggle as he unveiled tax cuts and other measures to prop up an economy expected to slow further this year. Premier Li Keqiang told the opening session of China's annual National People's Congress that the government is targeting growth of 6 to 6.5% this year for the world's second largest economy, lowering its range from 2018. The slowdown and trade war have become major challenges for President Xi Jinping 1 year after the NPC boosted his status as the country's most powerful leader since Mao Zedong by abolishing term limits and etching his name into China's constitution. The government had set a target of around 6.5% in 2018 and eventually recorded official growth of 6.6%, the slowest pace in nearly 3 decades. 3/4 of provinces have already lowered their annual growth targets this year. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the Chinese slowdown and what it means for the world. Joining me on the program today are Jayant Das Gupta, former ambassador of India at the WTO, Ajay Shankar, former secretary DIPP, Ravi Prasad Narayanan, Associate Professor, Center for East Asian Studies, JNU, and Ajay Dua, former Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ms. Dua, I'd like to begin the program with you. Let's first try and understand, of course, what does a slowdown for the Chinese economy mean, and how would you look at the Chinese slowdown?
Frank, I'm not as perturbed as a lot of people around the world are. 6.5% on a base of $12 trillion is a lot of accretion or a lot of growth for the economy. If you, as you very correctly said in your introduction, the Chinese have had a very long burst, I would call, steady, I can't call it a burst, a very long period trend of double-digit growth, something which had peaked in 2008 to 14% rate of growth, and that's post the Lehman crisis, also they recorded 14%, and in the last 3 years up to 2016 or 17, they had a double-digit growth of 10%. Now that China is become a large economy over the last 3 decades and certainly over 2 decades, it is becoming what we call in economic terms a mature economy. A mature economy, after a while, when all the low-hanging fruits have been picked up, certainly has to feel a kind of a slowdown, which the Chinese have started experiencing from 2018 onwards. The fact of the matter is, today, Chinese have a 20% share of the global economy. China has huge exports. China continues to grow. And Chinese have, we must remember, a very low inflation. Chinese continue to have prosperity across the board, much more rapid amelioration of poverty than we have seen anywhere in the world.
Right.
Certainly, some bearish movement is there, and it has probably got a little exaggerated, exasperated in the context of the trade war, which is going on between the 2 largest economies of the world.
Right. Ambassador Das Gupta, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. So what's causing this present slowdown in China? I mean, why isn't China still registering double-digit growth?
There are quite a few factors which underlie this slowdown. I agree with Mr. Dua that, a mature economy can't keep on growing on a large base at double-digit rates. So that was to be expected. The second issue is that China, reaped very huge dividends from its single-child policy, from having more and more people join the workforce. So in terms of the workforce compared to the total population, it kept getting better and better till 2012, when it peaked. And then again, the productive workforce compared to the total population has declined, which means that because of the aging population, less percentage of people are involved in working. The second issue was about the efficient allocation of resources. The third issue is that China for almost 3 decades showed a 17% growth in exports, which contributed hugely. And the last point is that China invested in heavily in infrastructure, which kept its economy booming and also helped tremendously in its export effort. And that is now slowing down because there are limits to how much you can spend on infrastructure. And one of the things which has happened is that there is a huge debt overhang now. It is about 300% of the GDP of China. That is what is also there in the background. And this was mentioned by Premier Li Keqiang in the annual policy report also. So China has this problem of, it has chosen to provide $238 billion worth of tax cuts to stimulate the economy. Spending needs to be pushed up in order to stimulate the economy, to push up the growth rate. But if it has a very loose money policy, then it will be a problem. So China has to do a tightrope walk, cutting down on taxes, but at the same time keeping some stimulus in the economy so that growth does not come down very sharply.
Right. Mr. Shankar, so how will the measures taken by the government, like, the cutting of taxes and so on and so forth, how will it help the situation really?
Now, if you look at the Chinese Premier's statement, he recognizes and is preparing the people of China for a period of slower growth. So he said, now we want quality development. And his problem is managing domestic expectations of very high growth, because as a mature economy, and with the fact that the Western markets are now not growing as fast as they were earlier to absorb their exports, and there is this trade friction with the US. So China has to get used to a far lower rate of growth. But what needs to be borne in mind is the Chinese have been very smart and very focused in trying to get into leadership positions in all the sunrise industries and technologies. So they are the global leaders in electric cars, they've made over 1 million. They are the global leaders in solar power. They are also leaders now in nuclear power. They are working on robotics, they are working on artificial intelligence. So they are very systematically preparing themselves for a global leadership role of the kind which the US has had in the last century. So this modest slowdown, and the slowdown may go further, because if you look at the US for 50, 60 years, it has never grown beyond 3.5%, 4%. So the Chinese are preparing themselves for that kind of more modest growth, but a technological and economic leadership over the world. In terms of the stimulus that they have done, this is to manage domestic expectations. And in fact, the slowdown in China was expected from about 10-11. But they have continued to indulge in a domestic stimulus on the spending side, and which has given them high growth rates for the last few years. And that has led to some excess capacity creation in housing, in real estate, and in infrastructure. So now they are hoping to do tax cuts and again get some kind of a stimulus, but they realize now that they have to settle down for lower rates of growth and try and attain technological leadership across the spectrum.
So about 5.5% to 6.5% is going to be the new normal as far as China's
I suspect it will go down to 3.5%, 4%, because some external observers of the Chinese economy have said, because they've always had a problem of credibility in their government data. So their expectation in a conference a few days back was the growth rate is actually 5%.
All right. All right. Ravi Prasad Narayan, how are the people of China going to look at this? Are they ready for an economic slowdown really?
Good evening, Frank. It's been a pleasure listening to the other panelists speaking, and I'm broadly in agreement with the assessment made so far. Let's look at it this way. In China, much as it is in most Asian countries, one cannot separate the economy from politics. All politics is domestic, and let us look at China's current economic growth rates as being part of a domestic process of consolidation in very many ways, and also consolidation in other ways too. These rates which have come down are expected, in the sense it's been expected for quite some time, and they're going to last at least for a decade plus. And as a previous panelist had said, this should be considered as the new normal. And secondly, as it was mentioned, China's internal debt is worrying, close to 300%. The Economist says it is around 250% of the GDP, which means that China is going the way of Japan. Japan also has, a domestic debt which is 2.5 times more than the size of the GDP. So maybe it's a new aspect of East Asian economic growth. Now, the other aspect is politics, because politics in China cannot be separated from the economy, because number one, all land is owned by the state. And people who have benefited most, who are the princelings in the party and others from real estate deals, transactions, whatever, they hardly pay any income tax or any tax on the rent that they have generated through their connections, which they say Guanxi. Other aspect is this, that only around 1% of Chinese actually pay income tax honestly. Now this is very worrying, because it shows grave dislocations in the financial system within China. The other part, which is political, is that we all assume and we understand that Xi Jinping is fully in control of everything in China. I will say yes and no, because there are factions within the party who are loath to having Xi Jinping accumulating so much power and weaving his name into their constitution. And this is where their challenges come for Xi Jinping, which is why he is willy-nilly trying his best to hold on to power, which he will for the foreseeable future. But there is no second generation person within the party who can pose a challenge, which is why he's surrounded by what we would say politely flunkies. So
Right.
Politics and economics are mixed very seriously in China, where this country is deep in debt internally. Externally, it has been very ambitious, spreading billions and billions of dollars. The Maritime Silk Road Initiative to begin with, the One Belt, One Road. These are plans with a lot of financial outgo without any expected returns in the future.
Right. Interesting that, you spoke about Xi Jinping, and probably there's some kind of trouble domestically. I want to talk about that a little later on in the program as well and delve deep into it. But before that, Mr. Ajay Dua, you spoke about how the economic slowdown in China is over-exaggerated really at this point in time because of the sheer size of the Chinese economy. But if you talk about the sheer size of the Chinese economy itself and seeing that it is in a mode of slowdown, what kind of an impact is it going to have on the world economy, if any?
Frank, let me first, if you'll allow me to mention about the Chinese government response, to which the Prime Minister referred to in his speech when he announced the scaling down of the expectations. I thought that was remarkable in terms of the maturity which has been shown by the Chinese authorities. First, he said we are going to be rationalizing the value-added tax, so that their stimulus is not pumping in more money, but cutting down on the government revenue in order to stimulate certain sectors of the economy which were experiencing the slowdown. And as we know, it has not yet the consumer sector, including the luxury consumer sector dominated by the foreign brands there, but it is machinery making in China, which is whether the Japanese export to it or they make it themselves, including in the power sector, as well as a lot of consumer durables. They would like to see those goods, their prices of those coming down. And I would say an earlier speaker had talked about the dividend, the population dividend because of one-child policy. All that I'll try to say, that bit got over a long time ago. For the last 5 to 6 years, that they are paying the price of it because the wages in China have gone up astronomically, and I think that's the correct description, because they have realized that they were losing space to lower income category countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and many Indonesia, etc. Second response, again a mature one, the Chinese are not thinking of lowering the interest rates very much. It is a moderation in the interest rates, because the Chinese would not like to see too much of money in the economy, which could kind of lead to inflation. And
Right.
inflation has always the potential of causing social unrest if it goes out of control. The third and the biggest, I think, the measure which the Chinese Prime Minister announced was opening up the country to FDI, including in Chinese companies, something which was not happening so far, and the entire financial market, the global financial market, has responded to it very positively. People are now saying the valuations in China of companies which are producing for the large Chinese market, and some of them even for exports, are suddenly becoming attractive. That, I would think, is one of the biggest impacts of the measures taken to kind of check the slowdown, and the global markets. You could see a fair amount of investment now going into China.
Right.
MSCI index, the global index, like our Sensex, is more of MSCI, called the MSCI index. MSCI index has, the authorities have announced, we would be including in it. Henceforth, now that China is open, a number of Chinese companies' prices as well.
Right.
That's one, and I'll end this my observation by saying, yes, there is going to be a little bit of softening of commodity prices, because the extent of commodity prices, what China was importing, whether it is copper, whether it was coal, whether it was even hydrocarbons, depended on what was the consumption level in China.
Sure.
If Chinese China's overall production slows down, then we would see a positive effect, and we have seen that in case of oil and coal already, softening of the prices.
Right. Yeah, Ambassador Dasgupta. So, how much of an impact, has the trade war with the US really had on the Chinese economy?
It has had a very, perceptible dampening effect, because the goods that China was sending out to the US, a lot of it was coming in the form of intermediate goods. Certain raw materials were also getting imported by China. So it has affected, apart from the Chinese exporters who were exporting directly to the US, it has also affected the supply chain, and other countries have been affected. There are certain items in which China, of course, had an overcapacity, and it was dependent largely on the Western countries, the US mainly, and the European Union. So once that the US market became more difficult to penetrate, the Chinese production had to be cut down, and there are reports, for instance, in certain industries like steel, where there have been layoffs, and it has created some social unrest in certain provincial towns of China. So the Chinese economy has been affected, and if this continues beyond the 1st of April, then it will, of course, have a much deeper impact. But from the reports that are coming out of China, of the talks between Lighthizer and the Chinese premier and the commerce minister, I think somewhat watered down version of the expectations of the US, which they had articulated earlier, that is going to be the final result, and there could be an agreement very shortly.
Sure, sure. Mr. Shankar, will we see a revival of the Chinese economy in the near future?
Very unlikely. I think China has entered a phase which Japan entered in the 80s, a period of very modest growth. and difficulties in handling its internal debt problem, similar to what Japan went through, and a comparable demographic decline. So China has begun to age and will age rapidly, and therefore the problems it will experience in the coming decades would be similar to what Japan has experienced in the last 2-3 decades. The only difference between Japan and China is, and would remain, is that this relative stagnation is occurring at a very high income, but an income per capita which is considerably lower than that of Japan.
Right. Ravi Prasad Narayanan, how big a problem is the economy for President Xi Jinping domestically?
Domestically, any economic decline in China affects the Communist Party of China when it comes to its internal legitimacy. Why? Because the Communist Party of China should be seen as an umbrella organization with a lot of factions. Many of these factions, or rather I shouldn't say many, there are several factions who are opposed to Xi Jinping for several reasons. Firstly, that he does not have a background from the PLA. So you have the retired PLA officials who have a faction lobbying against Xi Jinping and his absolute appropriation of power at every level. Second is that you also have certain groups in Shanghai who are coalescing around to oppose Xi Jinping, and this was in the last party congress when Chu Rongji, the former premier, had advised Xi Jinping to focus on the economy and not on appropriating power. He did not mention Xi Jinping by name, but in the documents that came out, it is said very clearly that individuals should not be entirely responsible for the party, because the party is a collective endeavor of the people of China,
Right.
which was a tongue-in-cheek disapproval of what Xi Jinping has been doing. So politics in China is also very fluid at this moment, although Xi Jinping is an absolute power in every realm, and he also has a deputy, the premier, who actually does not have any support base, because having a support base within the party is the ultimate insurance policy.
Right.
The economic aspects of China, yes, there'll be the new growth rate is going to be half of what it used to be in the past. Those days of double-digit growth are gone, and as one of the panelists had said earlier, it is going to be akin to what Japan had gone through in the 1980s.
Right.
So this is going to be the new normal, and what we have to watch very cautiously is, my readings tell me, every time China has faced an economic crisis, they have not stopped short in advancing internationally in military terms.
Right.
1962, the war happened when China had a severe economic crisis internally. 1979, when the war happened with Vietnam, the reforms had just been inaugurated and it was not being welcomed by the people, who felt that too fast things are moving and hence they will be cut out. This was when the party, to re-establish its superiority and also the great sovereignty of China, decided to send the PLA outwards.
Right. Points
Of course,
taken,
the
Ravi Prasad
PLA
Narayanan. I've got
is a
about 2 minutes
remarkable
left on the
instance
program,
of
so
a
I'd like to get quick closing comments from all the guests right now on what the slowdown means for India. Starting first with you, Mr. Dua.
Slowdown for India, there was an opportunity in terms of our exports becoming more competitive because of the labor problems, or the labor shortage in China. And the Americans we had reached out to the Americans and vice versa. The Chinese also wanted to build up more trade with us. But yesterday's decision of President Trump to grant an indefinite extension in hiking up the rates to 25%, which he had threatened on a whole host of Chinese items, and continue to keep these at 10%, to some extent narrows that window of our building up on our exports to China, particularly in the space vacated by China, our exports to the US vacated by China, and vis-a-vis China, probably not yet. The things haven't opened up much. We continue to have a huge deficit with them,
Right.
and I would think that if their normal trade with China, with the US resumes, we won't possibly be affected too much, except this correction in the supply chain, which has occurred in recent years. If a few things were going
Right.
from India, which were in the supply chain of exports from China to the US, those would get corrected. Let me just say one other
I'm running
thing.
out of time, Mr. Dua. I'd like to get comments in from the other panelists as well. Ambassador Das Gupta.
I think, the Chinese economy owes a lot to the 17% growth it enjoyed for almost 3 decades in exports. Now, the world economy is growing at only about 3.5%. So, the Chinese exports are going to slow down as well. And China is going to vacate the space of labor-intensive industries like garments, for instance. So that provides us with an opportunity. And in other similar labor-intensive sectors, there will be a vacation. The Chinese will try to shift their factories, their setup, and we can also attract investments, provided we get our own house in order and set the conditions, make the conditions attractive.
Mr. Shankar.
This presents us with a huge opportunity. But it is up to us to make most of that opportunity by getting our internal factors right to be competitive in global manufacturing. And that, unfortunately, is still a work in progress.
Ravi Prasad, please close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Yes, to China, every crisis is an opportunity. So this is a time when China is going to refocus its energies in expanding its technological presence in the world through the new means it has attained. And so China is preparing for the technological revolution beyond the industrial revolution of the past.
Right.
And as I said, it is an opportunity for China to understand where it stands and what it can do to come out of this current crisis, which they see as temporary.
All right. On that note, then, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.